everybody. Can you hear me? Great. Sorry for the slightly late start. We were just waiting for more attendees to sign in. But now that we're all here, I wanted to welcome you to this webinar on safety on advertising in the time of COVID-19. And I'm very excited to talk about this topic today, along with my co-presenters who are sitting in Hong Kong right now as we speak. And first, I'd like to introduce Lu Wee, our Business Director for Hong Kong and Regional. Say hi, Lu.
I'm on mute. I'm not.
Yeah. We can hear you. And of course, next to him is our Head of Digital, Ian Hocking.
Hi there, how you doing?
Great, thanks guys. So as you can tell, we're doing it all remotely in different places. In Singapore, we're still under lockdown until the 1st of June. And for a lot of the colleagues in Hong Kong, they've all gone back to work and are in the office. And I hope that a lot of you are also making sure that you're enjoying your lockdown at home the best way you can, or being safe when you go back out to the office in person. So I see that we're okay with audio and visual. And with that, I think I'd like to just do a little bit of housekeeping where if you guys have any questions, you can just hover across your Zoom screen and you'll see that there's a little Q&A box at the bottom. I can see that a lot of you are already familiar with the chat function. So ask us the questions in the Q&A box, but chat with organizers in the chat box. And also at the end of our webinar, we'll actually be sending a post-event survey. There's a QR code access as well as a link once you close your Zoom window. So do help us get better by just simply clicking on that link and making us, giving us feedback. Excellent. Giving us feedback so that we can actually make our next webinar a better experience for everyone. So with that being said, I'd like to launch into the first subtopic of the day, which is to look at how long the effect of COVID-19 will last and how bad is it right now. So I think, in the sort of vein of being honest and trustworthy with SCMP brand, we want to tell it like it is. We don't want to hold back any punches to say that it's not going to be a bad period for us, because the truth is that when we look at analyst forecasts, and this particular graph is actually from the IMF, thank you, Carmen, for changing the slide. We are actually looking at a forecast comparing the Great Lockdown, as this COVID-19 is now being called, with the global financial crisis, which is one of the more recent recessions in the history of our modern economy. So you can see with the IMF, they've looked at actually the top 5 largest economies in the world and done a forecasting to compare the impact on both. And you can see that the likely extra falls for the Great Lockdown is actually significantly higher for 4 out of 5 of the country's largest economies. So we will not be expecting a real turnaround that anytime soon. So while it is a little bit bleak, it gives us an idea of what to expect. It is still a forecast, so of course we take it with a pinch of salt, but we must, as marketers and advertisers and business people, be understanding of the reality of the potential situation. And therefore, going to that, a more in-depth look at the advertising and marketing industry. Carmen, if you could move to the next slide, please. We can see that actually the coronavirus pandemic has affected many, many clients, many, many budgets all over the world. And also, media publishers are not being spared. From the smaller, more traditional publishers like our neighbors, Blue Ink magazines in Malaysia, all the way to like large conglomerates like Disney, as well as even Google and Facebook, have been feeling the pinch of the coronavirus impact on marketing budgets. For us at SCMP, we're lucky that we had the foresight to do our digital transformation, so we were not impacted the way that Blue Ink Media was. And we are also very cognizant of the fact that we have to cover the stories that matter, because we're close to the ground and we're able to actually bring the facts to life and to understand what's the next part of this pandemic by actually looking mostly at most of our own insights. So our SCMP reporters, given that our mission statement is to lead the global conversation about China, was actually one of the first few reporters to break the news about coronavirus. This was when it was still being known as a mystery illness with pneumonia-like symptoms in China. And you can see that if we were risking the lives for this story, we have gone over a range of different things from the first start of the outbreak in Wuhan all the way to sections launched around the coronavirus updates and lessons that can be learned from this pandemic. So today, I'll actually go from that IMF forecast to talk a little bit more about how we can expect to come out of it to recovery. And then Lou will carry on and to talk about some specific frequently asked questions on how it impacts the economy. So just this week, Carmen, yes, the next slide was correct. We can actually look at the fact that our SCMP reporters have launched a special in-depth series of 6 stories exploring the economy of China and the changes that have taken place with the pandemic. So since China was one of the earliest in and now the earliest out of this virus lockdown, we actually can take the learnings from what we see here so that we can get some expectation what will happen next. Carmen, next slide, please. Some immediate takeaways is that unemployment rates will not go down quickly in many major economies. This is the reason of this is because a lot of these major economies remain very large, so there's a high amount of rural-urban migration, and larger companies that are more impacted by the infection have actually had a longer length of lockdown. And this means that the travel restrictions will stay in place for a little bit longer. So rural-based villages, for example, will earn less when they used to work in the cities as retail, dining, and events industries remain highly impacted. In fact, some learnings from the Chinese economy show that since 2 months ago, when China first came out of the lockdown, revenue at restaurants is still only at 60% of pre-virus levels. Similarly, due to global travel limitations, businesses that rely on exports and travel should also expect a slower recovery. And if we think about it for cash flow and loan limitations, where it hits businesses most is mostly in the small, medium enterprises, as well as mergers and acquisitions businesses. This is going to be impactful for companies and brands that actually rely on SMEs, which make up a large bulk of most countries in the world. Thereby, this will long-term impact employment income and therefore consumer sentiment. Now, how long will this last? The IMF has a prediction where when we look at the global financial crisis, there was basically a U-shaped sort of recovery because the impact of the global financial crisis on many businesses took slightly longer to assess and for governments to acknowledge. But with the COVID crisis, the difference here is that governments have been forced to acknowledge it and react to it a lot faster. And therefore, the optimistic economists are actually predicting a slightly quicker recovery with the COVID-19 at a faster pace to come back from the yellow line, as you can see, which is the downside of it, to the red dotted line, which is a slightly higher, more normal line of economy. So when we compare these two, optimistically, we can hope to say that the COVID-19 recovery will be slightly faster than the U-shaped recovery of the global financial crisis. So please, according to your individual brands and countries that you are based in, plan your recovery and marketing efforts based on this type of knowledge. Of course, we also encourage that you look at your own industry needs and understanding your consumer needs to make sure that you make the most of it. Next slide, please, Carmen. Now, if we think about who is going to win the race for recovery, we actually have relied on the insight of Neil Newman, who is a thematic portfolio strategist at Light Research. Now, he's based in Hong Kong, and he has looked at many economic events across the invention of modern economics. And he has deduced that Asia will actually be the winner in global recovery. Why? Because generally, APEC governments have less debt than Western counterparts. Of course, it's arguable. I'm not going to go into details, but given the unprecedented nature of this pandemic, there are signals of greater success with such government positions with lower debt. And secondly, we also see that there are many countries in Asia that actually have managed to have control over infection, like Vietnam, Hong Kong, and a lot of Southeast Asia. So we actually will be hoping that Asia will be indeed the winner of this race to recovery so that we can get back to business as fast as possible. Now, the second point where if we think about how global manufacturing and supply chain has evolved over the last decade, and especially, a lot of reliance has been put on one or two places of manufacturing. So there will be a lot of global businesses that start to see the risk related to relying on certain places for supply chain, and therefore will shift from a reliance of this more horizontal spread out of supply to vertical. When we have this relocation and diversification of distribution sources, the changes will actually impact more consumer industries like travel and retail, as well as create actually less risk for certain companies, certain types of brands, certain types of businesses to have less disruption and more local dependence. Now, if we think also about where we're coming from as SCMP in media sales, our combined 50 years experience from Lou, Ian, and myself shows us that having some resilient industries, and those are namely investment banking and healthcare. We're not saying that no budgets have been cut, and that activity has not gone down, but we are saying that they are more resilient in this type of pandemic situation. And other industries that I'm sure you all know as astute business people as well, that there are some industries that are maintaining or even increasing marketing efforts, such as e-commerce, e-wallet, delivery, logistics, and this morning I found out dating sites as well. So there's still some hope in the market. And in terms of SCMP stance, we have already seen some turnaround, especially in the Chinese and Hong Kong markets where where the lockdown has ended earlier, where tourism, government, and property, and I know some of you in the audience are actually from these industries, they're really interested to restart again, and it's been very, very positive that way. So moving on to my last slide, we want you to keep positive. We do have the economist forecast that can swing both ways, but IMF is trying to lean towards that V-shaped recovery. So let's take their guidance, and with a little bit of optimism, we're looking at research that's showing more positive signs, like from Campaign India, where 83% of agency heads in India predict a return to normalcy by as early as the end of 2020. And in addition, McCann World Group has actually been doing an ongoing survey, which is called The Truth About Global Brands. And it's very interesting to see that 77% of people globally believe brands have the power to accelerate positive change. Not only do they believe this, they actually believe that brands have more of the power to accelerate change than governments of certain countries. So I think what this says to us is that as marketers, as people who work with the advertising industry and with brands, that we actually have a certain responsibility and ownership to help to make the world return to normalcy. So with that, I'll end off my section to say, don't be afraid to communicate, show your value, stay positive. I know Lou will cover off more about some frequently asked questions and impact on specific brands. So with that, I hand it over to you, Lou.
Thanks, Dawn. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you again for joining this webinar. As Dawn introduced me, my name is Lou Wee. I head up the advertising business for the South China Morning Post. But being responsible for the largest market of the Post, which is Hong Kong, a market wherein the economy has been in recession for the last even before the global pandemic started. We've been in recession for several months before that because of social and civil unrests. And so I've had a head start in trying to understand recessions before everybody else, trying to understand how this has affected our industry in the past and how we've sort of overcome it. Now, of course, no two recessions are alike. And so a lot of us who've probably experienced the last recession may be still finding ourselves in unfamiliar waters right now. Now, truth be told, a lot of us in the advertising, marketing, and media industry professions are probably not having a great time right now. Of course, apart from worries over job security, there is that added pressure, which is born of the fact that a lot of business leaders still see marketing as this expendable cost. Now, Perhaps though, if we have the questions, we have the answers to the right questions that are often asked. Now, these questions are very common questions, but they're often very divisive questions asked about advertising during a recession. Then perhaps we might be able to sort of stop the brands that we are looking after from a destructive cost-cutting exercise. And the first question is the most basic question, but it also needs to be addressed. Now, is this affecting everybody? Now, according to the IAB, as early as March 2020, by the end of March 2020, about 70% of media buyers have already paused or put a stop to their advertising efforts. Now, of course, we look at like statistics from ComScore that tracks site traffic. They've shown that, traffic to sites like online retail banking, corporate banking, there's a lot of inquiries on insurance. A lot of people are going up to insurance sites. Government service sites have increased in traffic as well as education. However, if you look at conversion in business, that doesn't correlate to it. Now, the truth of the matter is a lot of brands across multiple categories have already put a stop to their advertising. Now, we all know that maybe the usual suspects are, brands in the retail space, brands in the travel and hospitality space, and these are industries that we know have been greatly affected. But if you look at, you think about sports manufacturers, sports equipment manufacturers, these brands are no longer able to sell their products because large sporting events have been canceled. If you look at the steel industry with construction projects being on hold, if you look at the UK, for example, the steel industry has been on a slump. Now, this economic recession we're facing caused by this global pandemic does not discriminate in terms of large and small businesses. If we're looking at the impact it has on the global supply chain and reduction in consumer spending, this means this affects everybody, large and small, which means that your competitors are affected, and realizing this and constantly thinking about it will help you answer the next question, which is, will cutting back on advertising save my brand from financial ruin? This is less of a question, but more a way of thinking, right? But we could probably start by learning from a very good case study about this. It was the Kraft and Heinz merger back in 2017. Now, as part of their merger strategy, the company practically cut back on all their advertising and marketing spending. And as a result, experts say this has led to these long-term effects on their brand and a significant decline in their stock price at that time. Now, this was caused by the fact that cutting back on their marketing during that time alienated a lot of their distributors, alienated a lot of their direct consumers, which also then contributed to an erosion of their market share. Now, advertising is especially essential during a recession, because consumers, we have to remember, consumers are not loyal. According to McKinsey, about 60% of consumers switch upon that initial consideration stage. And this consumer loyalty becomes even more of a problem when we're facing a recession, as consumers become more price sensitive. Now, the value of advertising during a recession further becomes more relevant because it's the only way for brands to stay visible and stay top of mind. Now, another report from the 2007-2009 recession by Millward Brown, which is now Kantar, said 60% of brands that went dark, and going dark means completely cutting back on all form of advertising, saw metrics like brand image, brand awareness, and brand usage decline by as much as 39%. Now, you might be wondering, now a lot of you are probably facing this next question, which is a very big misconception when it comes to advertising during a recession. and that is, should I not advertise because I won't get results? And the answer to that is no. All right. We all know that not advertising is bad for long-term growth, but it could also be bad for short-term growth. All right. And not taking advantage of advertising right now during a recession, all right, will cause you to miss out on certain opportunities. Now, the first one is obviously the fact that right now we're facing a buyer's market. Now, based on the laws of supply and demand, the cost of advertising during a recession is expected to drop. Now, if you look at a recent Wall Street Journal CMO Today report, which showed that about 25% of the price of social media ads, like Facebook ads and Instagram ads, have since declined in the last few months, particularly in the periods of January and February. Reports even showed a decline in price of social media ads by as much as 50%. Now, of course, when you're facing a lower cost of a landscape wherein the cost of advertising has decreased, you're also facing opportunities for lower cost of acquisition, as long as you plan your marketing campaigns efficiently. Now, another reason for why now is actually a good time to be advertising is that reduction in noise levels. Noise levels for many brands across categories would have reduced right now because a lot of your competitors and those category leaders have cut back on their advertising. Now, this gives you an opportunity. This gives you an opportunity to win back that market share, win back some of that share of voice. And why now is a good time to do this? Because it'll take you a lot less effort to be doing that. Now, since we've talked about sort of these two reasons for why now is a good time to advertising, I think I want to just bring back to one good case study from during the early 1980s recession in the US. Now, you had McDonald's, who was then the industry leader, the fast food industry leader. When the recession hit, McDonald's initial reaction was to completely cut back on their advertising. Rivals Taco Bell and Pizza Hut, however, saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of that reduction in the noise in the market, and both companies invested more in their advertising. As a result, Taco Bell and Pizza Hut shares increased, and so did their sales. And McDonald's saw a reduction in market share, and their profits during that time reduced by as much as 30%. Now, we know that advertising during this recession has its advantages, right? So what could be worse than advertising during this recession? And the only thing that's worse during advertising during this recession is assuming that everything is still the same, right? Because things aren't the same. Your target audience, your consumers, for example, have changed. I mean, they're facing unemployment. They're facing a lot of stress born out of this recession. You know, a lot of health concerns and concerns about the future of the economy, right? So do not assume that the consumers are thinking the same way as they did pre-recession, which means that you have to relook at your traditional audience segmentation, which during recessions become less important. Segmentations that are more demographic driven, like age, their marital status, their age, their lifestyle choices, whether or not they're eco-friendly consumers or whether or not they're avid travelers. These become less important, and what takes over are the psychographic segmentations, which is basically how your consumers are thinking when it comes to this economic recession. So you have to sort of then consider how these consumers are reacting to this recession or this pandemic. Now, while you're doing that, you then determine how these consumers are seeing your brand. Now, they could either be seeing your brand as something that's expendable or something that's that they can actually still consider to purchase at the moment, right? And when you're mapping these out, and there's a good chart here on the slide, which was put together by Harvard Business Review post 2007 recession, which arranges consumers and classifies the 4 different types of recession consumers as slam on the brake consumers, consumers that have completely put a stop to all spending and buying. You've got your pain but patient consumers, the ones that aren't right away affected by it, but they're rather sort of pessimistic in terms of sort of like outlook. Chances are these pain and patient consumers move into and becoming slam on the brake consumers. Then you've got your comfortably well-off consumers and consumers that practically live off the moment, and this recession does not faze them at all. And then on the upper hand of this table, then you get to classify your products from being expendable to something that's essential. And where you rank your product then ultimately decides how you sort of create tactics around this recession. So essentially, you can either choose to advertise during this recession, but if you do it the wrong way, you could be doing worse things. But whatever you do, I think either whether or not you choose to advertise or not, the best thing you should be doing is to not be doing anything. Which leads to the 5th and the final question, which is, can you just wait this out? A lot of marketers and a lot of the brands are probably either they're not sure if they should be advertising and they're not sure if they should not be advertising, and they're choosing to take the middle ground and to just wait this one out. However, if we look at past recessions, and I know Don talked about how this recession is not necessarily the same as past recessions, and we're hoping to recover from this recession a lot quicker. But if you look at the previous recession, which is the 2008 recession, it took the advertising industry, or more specifically, global advertising spending, 3 years to resume to normal levels. Now, what does this mean for your brand? If you are planning to wait this out, it could mean that you are going to be risking 3 years of your brand potentially eroding its brand image, its brand awareness, its share of voice, potentially spending 3 years losing market share to competitors who will choose to advertise during this recession. Now, if the perks of advertising during this recession does not attract you, don't just sit back, though. There are still things that you can do. Now, I'm going to talk about 2 specific things that you should be doing right now. The first thing is you should be innovating, right? So innovating is a very broad term. I'm going to give you one example of how brands should be innovating right now. Ironically, though, it is one of the oldest tactics in the recession playbook, which is the introduction of a fighter brand. Now, a fighter brand essentially is a brand that's introduced by a company that is a below the premium option to their core brand, to make sure that it doesn't erode the pricing of the core brand. This way, it stops companies from taking their brands below market, which means pricing their premium brands a lot less, just because they want their consumers to be able to still be able to afford it. Fighter brands, this is a good example of a fighter brand. During the 1800s recession, you had the Miller Brewing Company, who owned the premium brand Miller Beer during that time, introducing Colders 29 as a fighter brand. And that was meant to protect Miller Beer from the recession. Now, obviously, companies later on, post-recession, decide to either kill the fighter brand, or they eventually then absorb the fighter brand into their main product fold. Another thing that you could potentially do, and this is a bit of a wild card, so let me explain this to you a lot better. I feel like brands should be acting on a moral obligation right now. And you must be wondering what this means. So if you think consumers don't want you brands to be advertising right now, then you're wrong, right? So you had a Kantar survey recently that showed only 8% of consumers actually want brands to stop advertising. Now, 8%, that is a very low number. And about 75% of them actually said they want brands to be talking about the recession, to be telling them what they are doing, what the brands are doing around this recession. Now, we sometimes forget to realize the extent by which brands hold powers of communication right now. Take Nike, for example. Now, the brand Nike has about 300 million social media accounts. 300 social media accounts across major social media platforms. Now, on Instagram, it's the most followed brand. And it has the resources to reach a lot of people much more effectively than a lot of governments do. Now, take the WHO, for example. The WHO Facebook page has about 7.4 million followers, while Nike football Facebook page alone has about 43 million followers. And on top of that, Nike has access to billions in advertising dollars that they can use to extend that reach. So when Nike recently launched their Play Inside, Play for the World advertising campaign, they essentially advocated social distancing much more effectively than a lot of governments were able to do. So what I'm saying here is that I think this global health pandemic and the upcoming recession should put a lot of pressure on brands to uphold this unspoken obligation to not remain quiet and to contribute about speaking about this global pandemic and what people should be doing. Now, that's about it for the 5 questions. And I hope that what I've shared with you today, though, will be able to help you in your own organizations answer similar questions that would be asked of you about advertising in recession. And hopefully you'll be able to stop your brands from sort of going into their own recessions because your company is going to cut back on advertising. Now, I want to leave off with one good news, though. In spite of the fact that a lot of companies have chosen to stop advertising during this period, there's this survey from the World Federation of Advertisers that also show that about a similar percentage of them are thinking about creating new campaigns right now, which is good to know. So that's about the end of my presentation. I'm going to pass you on to Ian Hocking, who's our brand safety legend.
Hi, as I scoot into frame, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. It's been great to hear what Dawn and Lou have been able to discuss with us, and I really hope that everyone is finding this session useful. If you are, please feel free to comment, and also there is a question module, so you can ask us questions. If we have time at the end of this, we'll be able to answer some of those live questions. As Lou tells you, I'm the person here that's responsible for thinking about brand safety. What that means to us is ensuring that every time that somebody spends money with us, it's in a place where they want to be seen with the audience that matters to them. And so let's talk about the marketplace and how people are perceiving brand safety right now. Great indicators for that stem from are people buying ads. Here we have 2 graphs. The one on the left is by a company called Stack, and they look at the average yield in the open marketplace. And in April this year, they started off at a high, this year, they started off at a high of $1.34. And then it took a bit of a dive and is now at around 91 cents. And on the right-hand side is a graph by Index Exchange. And what they've got here are the number of bids. So these are the number of bids being made in the open marketplace. And as you can see from about March, the bids dropped massively, around 30 to 40% in most cases. But in some cases, extreme examples like travel, they dropped by 93%. However, this week we've seen index bids start to creep back up. They're up about 5 to 10% on average, which is amazing to see. That shows that there's a sentiment that people are starting to get moving and starting to buy again. But what was really, really interesting for me is that we saw that there was an initial price drop in the average yield before the bids dropped. And what that shows is that just the sentiment, the idea that the market might become a bit soft, drove a reduction in price. This means that together, as we start to feel like there is movement, that things are becoming back to normal, as we see bids start to come back and buyers generally have a stronger sentiment for the market, we should see that price go up and that market become much more of an enjoyable space. In order to talk about, is your brand really safe when you advertise at times like this, we should think about brand safety and the history of brand safety. The story of brand safety mechanisms really got kick-started in 2017 when the Times of London released an expose that showed people placing their ads around terror and extremist content on YouTube. Obviously, this is absolutely something that nobody wanted, and it wasn't really YouTube's fault or the advertiser's fault. It was just a bad situation. But this meant that a lot of major publishers, a lot of major SSPs and DSPs and brands stopped advertising for a while whilst they tried to reconsider the marketplace. The solution was really to add in extra checks, balances, and measures, and institute keyword ad blocking right the way across the ecosystem. That built more confidence that open marketplace and programmatic buying was still something that you could do and that you weren't going to put your brand at jeopardy, and allowed the market to get going again. And that's the way we've kind of operated now for the last quite a few years. There were a couple of people that were dominant in this space and still are today. IAS, or Integral Ad Science, that was favored by the buy side, so agencies and clients, and Grapeshot, which is now owned by Oracle, that was favored by the sell side, publishers like SCMP. There were two main, so these two people became the main way that we considered brand safety. The way that they work as a business is that they have keyword lists that they segment into verticals. And the advertiser can choose to run through whole verticals that they've created or create bespoke versions. But typically, people will take the suggestion of the brand safety vendor and just run with these fairly vast lists. And this is kind of how it works in the ecosystem. So a client will work with their activation channel, and that activation channel will typically say, okay, in order to make sure that when we start buying across literally tens of thousands of websites, we will engage with a brand safety vendor. And then we will say, okay, we don't want to be around nudity, we don't want to be around adult content, and they'll subscribe to these block lists. And then as they go through the ecosystem and they move from DSP through to SSP, which is the supply side platform, along the way, they were saying, okay, what is the context of this page? What's actually on that page? Is it going to be safe for my brand? And those that are safe progress to the website, and those that aren't bought. Now that sounds fantastic. And in the long-term environment, so on the unknown, unnamed websites where you just need to be sure that if you're buying in an environment you don't know, that you are safe, this is a decent but blunt tool to use. But then great publishers like Esquire and SCMP and The Guardian and Times will also employ their own brand safety measures, and that's when companies like Grapeshot would come in. And they would say, okay, we want to ensure that our environment is completely safe for all advertisers, no matter what is happening in the world. And so they'll apply their own bespoke brand safety lists. And what that can do is that can mean that we sort of double down on the situation, and we reduce the amount of inventory available to advertisers even more. So the situation that we currently find ourselves in perhaps isn't the most sophisticated or the most up-to-date way of dealing with it. Keywords tend to be a little blunt. The word shoot, for example, sounds like a keyword that you might want to avoid, but in the context of a photo shoot, it's probably completely fine. There are typically multiple standards that happen through the ecosystem, and the standards can be applied multiple times. This means that when you look at the entire amount of inventory that you could possibly buy, we can find massive reductions when these blunt keyword tools are applied. For example, in the case of COVID-19, publishers are typically seeing 70 or 80% reduction in inventory availability. And that means that brands are going to find it so much harder to reach their audiences and activate in quality environments. The next thing that could lead to is the advertisers themselves buying in lower quality environments. Places that don't have the same great environment, context, and thought and care that's brought into writing the content that we have. And I think we're all familiar with buying across networks when the users that you are buying, the clicks that you get, are just of a lower quality, and they don't post-click do as much for the brand. And so anything that leads people to that lower end of the marketplace should be something that we're all mindful of. And then modern tools should be able to monitor more than just that keyword. They should be able to think about things like context and environment to build a much more structured way of working. So what can we do about this? SCMP don't want to wait for the industry to catch up and think about how you should be tackling brand safety. And we know that brand safety itself needs to evolve into something that is more meaningful. Today, we think about something that we call brand suitability. And that's a mix of various measures. The first measure that we think about is not just the keyword, but the context of the article. We want to make sure that the context in which you are seen is right for you. So an alcohol brand may be okay around COVID-19 content, but absolutely will want to stay away from things for parents, parenting and children. And so finding that right context is really important. Thinking about the environment in which you are being told this is also really important. So, for example, a news site that is trusted, that is speaking on facts, really is a different environment to a social media site which may have a lot of user-generated content which can be unedited and unfiltered and may not come with the most trust in the ecosystem. And so what we have built is a tool that we call SCMP Signal, and from today onwards becomes the standard by which we ensure that every campaign that is launched with us is brand safe and is in the right place. And we measure it like this. We have an algorithm that reads our articles as they're being written by editors, and they look for positive and negative sentiment, and they rank every single keyword and then the overall context of a paragraph to let us know how that paragraph is likely to be perceived, and then overall the whole article. And as you can see in this diagram, it's visually represented by colors, so you can see that when Canon was looking for the best context for the new camera launch, they could find articles that talked in a positive way about photography, and we could discriminate words like shot that in this context didn't mean anything bad, and we could still enable you to reach the great audience that would be reading this article. And so SCMP Signal becomes a much more sophisticated way of thinking about brand safety. And so with that, we get to the end of my section thinking about whether, like, if you have chosen to activate a campaign, whether or not you can really be safe. And I really hope that through this you can understand that absolutely you will be safe with any great publisher that is thinking about your safety and managing that process as you set something live. We now go over to a Q&A session, and I think Dawn's going to lead this with some of the questions that you got in touch with us about before we went live.
Great. Thanks so much, Ian. That was very insightful. You know, having been in the industry for almost 20 years, I do see the evolving technology as being a real boon to brands and marketers out there. So, you know, the shift over from brand safety to brand suitability is supremely important. And as Ian mentioned, we thank you all for submitting some of your questions earlier. So we'd like to start with the first question, which I think falls very neatly with Lou's section of the presentation. So Lou, if you'd like to take this question, please.
Yeah, sure. So what is your recommendation for brands advertising during a pandemic and when recovery starts? So let's start with during a pandemic. Now, as I talked about earlier in my presentation, I think during this pandemic, it is important to not remain silent, but essentially as well, you'll need to really relook at your advertising strategies. And earlier I talked about you need to relook at how you segment your consumers, moving away from traditional demographic-based segmentations to more understanding the psychographics behind the consumers and how they're thinking about this pandemic. And then sort of create strategies around this. And then you identify whether or not your product falls under the spectrum of being essential or expendable. Another thing I want to say is that right now, because consumers are, obviously the appetite for consumer spending is rather low, the emphasis should be more on upper funnel marketing, wherein you're talking about branding or you're talking about your brand's values, and hopefully you sort of like save your brand values and your brand image from eroding during this pandemic period. You sort of like set aside those lower funnel marketing activities, conversion-led campaigns, and data has shown that those have actually dropped in terms of effectiveness. Now, post-recovery, I think, post-recovery will be a different period for each of us. It's not going to happen in one go. And you have to also be cognizant that your consumers, although you think as a business the economy has recovered, your consumers might not feel the same way. And so it's essential post-recovery to still be sensitive with your messaging, and to not be seen as being pushy again. So again, ease into those lower funnel marketing activities and focus, still spend time working on those upper funnel ones. I hope whoever asked this question, I hope I was able to answer it adequately for you.
Thank you, Lou. And can we move on to the next question, please? So I think reading this question about the real estate and travel industries, I can reply this following on Lou's recommendations. If we talk about these two particular industries, they are similar in a way that there is a lot of kind of movement and interaction, more face-to-face in many cases, in order to make both these industries effective. Learning from our real estate advertisers with SCMP and in my previous roles, we can see that actually real estate can make use of a lot of technology. So in the past, when in order to view a house, you have to physically go there or just take static pictures. Now there's 360-degree video views, with interaction around how you can actually tour real estate locations and get across that experience of understanding a space in a digital way with very, very little effort. You just need essentially your agent to get access to the house and film it with the right kind of software. And for the travel industries, I think that there's a similarity where with our Style magazine, we actually launched a travel community, unfortunately right at the time when COVID-19 started. But we're still seeing that there is this aspirational aspect of travel, which has always been the case, right? When you think about the Maldives, you start thinking about it where, how much budget can you set aside? When is a good time? Is it going to be an occasion type of visit that you're doing for travel. So I think real estate and travel have those types of similarities where they are really high consideration purchases in many cases. And for a lot of people out there, you can take advantage of this sentiment. Now, if you're talking about travel in terms of a big trip, you can think about it as high consideration, similar to real estate, where there's many touch points where you can share information about your product or service over a long period of time, so that as they go down the funnel of their buying decisions, they would be more ready to consider your product when they and exit out of lockdown. And if it's more like a short-term type of travel, very easy to go, it's about costs. I urge you, as Lou pointed out, that it's not about the immediacy or about the direct conversion right now for any purchase in most cases, especially travel. So think about how you can actually accommodate this future purchase of your product or service. For example, talking about a new travel dashboard that you have launched, innovations that you've made to your product and service standards, and assurances of quality and customer service that you can actually drive home the point on now. So I think in these times, we must be sensitive to Lou's point, and specifically for real estate and travel industries, you have to think about how you're actually going to be preparing for the stage when you can actually start to drive leads. But in the meantime, you can take advantage of this downside, so to speak, so that you can actually build branded content and the upper funnel type of awareness while being mindful to the sensitivities and always ask them to stay home. So I hope this answered the questions of whoever asked this, and I think that we can move on to question 3. We just have 5 minutes left for this last few questions, so let's see how much we can cover. So question 3 on budgets being cut. What is the advice to best make use of these reduced budgets? Maybe Lou and Ian, this looks like a good fit for you.
Sure, I'm sure we can. So with most budgets being cut, it's time to think about efficiencies and make sure that you're being as effective as possible. This, for every brand, is going to be a little bit different. For sure, for some of you, when you are thinking about consolidation and you're trying to drive as much into acquisition as possible, SEO channels are going to be a great choice. But for some of you, you want to remind them that you're here to support them, and you want to focus on that branding message. And when you want to do that, then you want to think about other channels, more premium channels. I think it's very hard to give a single answer to this question, but I would actively encourage you to really think about efficiency. What is the core purpose that you're trying to achieve? And then find the channel that is right for that and consolidate down to that one.
Thank you. Lou, anything to add on that?
No, that was a pretty good answer for me.
Great. So then I think if we move on to question 4, we'll try and take a step at the Q&A if we have time. I mean, the ones that are live asked. So question 4 for travel-related brands. I think I actually kind of answered this, but Lou, do you want to talk about the best time to restart?
I think the question shouldn't be around restarting, because you shouldn't be stopping right now. Again, restarting, there won't be any clear indicators. Of course, more obvious answers for the travel industry would be when travel bans are lifted. Now, again, these bans are not going to be lifted at the same time. And so I really think the question that you should be having right now is, should we be doing some upper funnel marketing as early as now and not be waiting for recovery to start?
Great. And I'm just reading the chat because, there's a lot of hope around travel. So I think we're all looking forward to that being restarted. And, I wanted to combine the Q&A live question that was just asked with question 5, actually, that's coming up next. Because it's a lot about, like, how are you actually incorporating your message for advertising during the COVID-19 period? And I think in the Q&A, one additional point the asker made is, for example, there's a campaign around spread love, not germs. Like, should this type of messaging be going out there, or should brands just be staying true to their core mission statement to take consumers' minds off this time? time. So I guess it's more of like, you address it or should we escape? You guys want to take a stab at that, or I'll try?
And then I can fill in.
Sure. So this is a personal opinion, but I think that that if you have something good to say about this, if you can think of an angle that really adds some sort of add something to the conversation that supports the community that you have, that builds your product value, then absolutely you should be referencing this and using this as a way to strengthen your brand identity. But if it is really quite random and it doesn't really apply to who you are, then of course stay away from it and to focus on the thing that really is going to prove your value.
Yeah, incorporating COVID-19 messages in your campaign, you have to be sensitive to not poke fun of the situation. So we know that consumers don't want you to be silent, but we also know that consumers are not happy with brands sort of taking advantage of the situation, sort of forcing products down their throat and sort of like forcing messages to sort of like adhere to the situation. And it becomes really blatant, and consumers are smarter than that. So yeah, so it's a yes and no answer.
Yeah, good points both. I think that, from a consumer perspective myself, I would question a brand and I'd have a follow-up if they had a statement about COVID-19. And, the natural fit would be that the reply from the brand would be the follow-up from whatever they said around COVID-19 would have to tie back in to what their purpose, product, or services actually offered without having that hard sell message. So, it is a very personal, subjective answer. But I think that we hopefully have explained it to the best of our abilities. And I think just given the restraints of time, we're going to skip question 6 because question 7 very well matches the most voted live Q&A question. So I think this actually looks good for Ian to answer because he's more across this from the digital side. Perhaps you can share with us a little bit more, Ian?
Of course I can. So obviously right now, every publisher is feeling the effects of the pandemic. Our yields have decreased, as Stack has shown, by 30 to 40% across the board. And more than that, where people have chosen to stop their brand activity and those pieces of branded content, it's really affected publishers because that is the area in which we build the most margin into our business. So for sure, this is making a difficult situation on the streets, a difficult situation for all publishers around the world. And you'll see that people are having to take action to streamline and to try and deal with this in the best way that they possibly can. And that's just a fact that everyone is having to deal with. However, as I showed earlier in my presentation, we are beginning to see the signs of people getting on board with change and starting to bid again and starting to buy again. And certainly here at SCMP, we're starting to receive briefs that show that people are preparing for that turnaround and that there is positive sentiment building. And although we are far from seeing the light, we are beginning to build the blocks that will get us back to normality. And so we want to really thank those of you that are here to have this conversation, that reach out to us to talk about how we can work together to build a better community, to reach consumers and ensure that we are prosperous together. So thank you so much for spending time with us today and asking some great questions. I know that we're all going to be available to you after this through LinkedIn and by email. So if anyone wants to get in contact, you absolutely can, and we can discuss anything that we've been talking today further.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's been very, very encouraging to see SCMP's views numbers grow up to 450 million across video as well as our page views. So it's been great, but from an advertising side, of course, with the impact of budgets, not a full transformation, but it's good to see Ian's data that is, driving us in the right direction for recovery. Everybody, thank you for attending. We'll have to tie up a little bit early. We had 10 questions planned, but we can't finish them all. But we thank you for your participation, and we hope that you can actually, continue to send us questions and also answer the post-event survey, please, you can take a phone and just scan this QR code for a very quick survey, or you can actually access the link once we close this Zoom video. But you've been a blast. I can't see most of you, but I imagine that that you are interested and engaged. Let's hope, fingers crossed. So you know, but any comments, please let us know. We have been honored to host this. Thank you very much. Stay safe.